this around the world, and it did to a certain degree. But certainly in recent years, there have been increasing concerns about the fact that technology, social media in particular, has been sowing discord. It has seeded and spread disinformation. It has separated us rather than brought us together. So how do we address these issues? How do we correct these issues? Can technology, which created the problems, help us solve some of these problems? To discuss these very important issues, we have an all-star panel. Let me ask them to come out to the stage right now.
Hi.
And joining me here on stage is Nick Clegg. Nick is Vice President of Global Affairs and Communications at Facebook. Also, Michael Chertoff, the former Secretary of Homeland Security in the United States. We have Laura Syer Christensen, who is founder of Concordium, and Sasha Havlicek. Sasha is CEO of the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Thank you all for being here with us, excuse me. But before we start our conversation, we have a phone call with somebody who was unable to join us. Let's place that call now. Hello, Mr. President. Thank you for joining us at the Global Democracy Summit. It is great to have you here with us.
Hello, everybody. It's great to speak to you all. You know, I love democracy. Nobody loves democracy like I do. I think that's why I got it.
Mr. President, have you been here to Copenhagen before?
I visited a few times before, and it's an incredible city. Strong economy, they've got there.
Strong economy and a whole lot of bicycles.
I've never been too far with cycling. I have tremendously good health, so I don't need to exercise too much. Very strong heart, my doctor says.
Mr. President, you're in Osaka, Japan for a meeting of the G20. Can you tell us how your conversations there are going?
It's going fantastically well. I've had lots of good conversations with lots of important people. The technology they have here is amazing. Musical robotic toilets and everything.
And sir, how about your discussions? How are those going?
We're here to discuss the economy, and it's going very well. I think America's economy is the strongest it's ever been. My policies have taken America from the worst to the best. Many of the countries in the G20 were killing us on trade, but my people have stopped that. Great people we have working on it.
You have some very important talks with the Chinese while you're there. Give us an update.
We're still working on these trade tariffs, China, but I can tell you it's going to be much, much better than it is at the moment. So what great things am I missing at the Democracy Summit?
Well, Mr. President, we have created a fake version of you.
I'm sorry, the line is very bad. Can you say it again? You said something about a fake version of you.
Yes, using machine learning, our friends at faculty have created something that looks and sounds very much like you. It's called a deep fake.
Fake version of me, what? That's impressive. I suppose an extra Donald Trump is no bad thing.
But the deep fake certainly posed some questions for democracy.
Very important. It play a huge role in our 2020 elections, I think.
It could change election results. It raises a lot of questions about how we get our information and how it is spread.
So are we really having this conversation right now, or is this just artificial intelligence?
Can you tell the difference? That's the question.
Some people here at the summit were asking me how we can tell what's real and fake anymore. But to be fair, we have tremendous problems with fake news in the United States. That's what matters to the American people in these elections.
Mr. President, let me ask you about some real news. The Democrats have debated the last 2 nights. Last night, one of the contenders on the Democratic side called you a fraud.
Thank you very much. Great to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you. So, Nick Clegg, I have to turn to you. If something like this, a deep fake, shows up on your platform, what do you do about it?
So at the moment, though we're looking at this, of course, like everybody is, to understand to anticipate the technology and the evolution of these deep fakes, cheap fakes, and so on. But at the moment, the approach would be much as it is to misinformation. Generally, if the video or the audio tape or whatever breaks the rules of the company such that it could lead to real-world harm, we would remove it. But otherwise, the general approach is to get fact-checkers to establish that it's false, and then to ensure that anyone who tries to share it, or who has shared it, is told that it's of dubious provenance, and to provide people with kind of associated information linked to it, so that people can, so that you deepen awareness about this new technology. I mean, there's a raging debate. We had it recently in the United States, as you know, about the
Nancy
Pelosi, which was not a deep, it was a cheap fake. It was literally just slowing down her. And of course, the political clamour is take it down, take it down. Actually, the vast majority of experts say, if you started playing whack-a-mole, taking stuff down, particularly in the political space, you'd get into very, very perilous territory as a platform quite quickly. So what we're trying to do at the moment is accelerate and speed up the process by which we can say to users, look, this is dodgy, to stop the virality of this content even before it's been fact-checked, and then examine whether there is a class of the sort of deepest of deep. I mean, with the greatest respect to the brilliant people who did this, I think you could probably quite quickly tell that it was artificial.
But it's getting better and
it's
better.
Getting better. It's getting better.
Hundreds, thousands of people are working on it.
But what we're trying to anticipate is when the content gets so good that it really just is impossible to see the seams and the joins, and whether we should and can put that in a separate category and apply more aggressive treatment of it.
Sasha, does this sound like an adequate solution to you?
Well, I think the companies still haven't got very clear policies on this bit of the problem online, and there are many harms, of course, that they deal with. I would say a lot more now really needs to be done in terms of signposting. If you're not going to be the Ministry of Truth, because I think that's what you're trying to avoid, and if you don't want to be taking down information just because it's false, because I think that was the statement, we don't want to remove things just because they are false, then you've got to be doing signposting better. I think right now, the signposting says something a little bit vague, like additional reporting is available on this piece of content. It needs to say, hold on, stop, see this has been doctored in order to manipulate you. And then there needs to be a lot more coordination. I think there's going to be a technological arms race to make sure that we can identify deepfake quite quickly.
We can't do that.
So that needs to be done very fast. It needs to be signposted in a way that normal people actually understand if you're not going to have a policy to remove it. And then there needs to be coordination between the companies. And this doesn't happen very often. It started to happen around terrorist content. It doesn't happen as well as it should in that area. But organizations like the Global Internet Forum on Counterterrorism that share hashes of content should be applied in this area.
Do you want to respond to that?
I agree with all of that. I agree with all of that. As it happens, what they call in the jargon the sort of interstitials, the sort of filter that tells a user, look, we use interstitials in lots of different contexts to obscure images which are distressing and so on. We've trialled in India a much more aggressive response, signposting response, precisely in the way that you describe. And I agree with greater industry cooperation, more forceful, clearer, more aggressive signposting to users, and crucially, because look, the heaviest responsibility of all the responsibilities that social media platforms bear is about virality. Because that's, in a sense, in as much as social media introduces great voice for people, it also introduces virality. And what we didn't do, candidly, quickly enough on the Pelosi video was to signpost to people that this was false or manipulated content quickly enough. So speed and how you get to speed, and I can get into the technicalities of it, is essential. And we very much hope that you will see in the months to come, particularly in the run-up to the 2020 election, real improvements on all of those fronts.
Michael Chertoff, detection is a real problem. There's one person working on detection for every 100 working to improve the technology. And frankly, once these things are seen, they can't be unseen, labeled or not. Right?
Well, and I think one additional thing that could be done is dealing with the issue of reinforcement. As people know, many platforms have an algorithm that if you look at a particular topic, it will direct you to other things that, quote, may interest you, and they tend to be more intense versions of what you looked at. So in addition to labeling, I would say when you've identified a deep fake or something in that category, in order to be taken out of the algorithm, that intensifies or reinforces the message. By the way, I have to say that I agree with Nick. I don't think that fake would have fooled people. It was far too lucid and rational. And but I do think we're going to get better imitations as we go forward. And I think speed will be important, because the real concern is something that drops literally the day before an election. And there you really have to operate with speed.
Lars, your firm is a blockchain firm. First, for those in the audience who may not be familiar with this technology, give us the 45-second primer on what blockchain is.
A blockchain is a distributed database, if you will, that because many people confirm the contents of that database at any given moment in time, what you put on it cannot realistically be changed or corrupted, etc. So it is a trust enabler whereby what you put on that blockchain has an extremely high probability of actually being untampered with, or you would know immediately if somebody had tampered with it.
So how could this technology be applied in the instance of deepfakes?
Well, actually, I think we turn a little bit on its head compared to what the other panel participants have been saying, because I don't think per se, at least I haven't thought of it, blockchain can help identify fake news, but it can help identify real news, true news, and I think that's where blockchain can make a real difference. This is actually a well-known use case for blockchain in general provenance. You know, there's so many copies of things out there, so you have today some of the big French vineyards are beginning to put their Chateau Latour on the blockchain, so you know when you get it, it hasn't been produced by somebody in Taiwan, etc., or rebottled or anything like that. You have lots of people producing widgets that want to prove that they're not copies from some other jurisdiction, etc. And here we're just beginning to see information being faked, right? So I believe that the real likely way to solve this in the long run will be that every time that the White House actually issues an important statement, they will stamp it, they will show the truth of that particular piece of information rather than trying to disprove the fakeness of the other ones. And I think we have to be realistic. This was a fun example. You could tell it was fake, but I absolutely guarantee you, and I've studied companies in that technology sphere, inside 24 months, there is no way you'll be able to tell the difference. And then it will be down to a manual assessment somehow. And I agree with that particular gentleman, it could be difficult to actually say, is this true or is it fake? And I don't think Facebook or anybody else really wants to be in that position to have to make that call. So ultimately, the real promise of the blockchain in this respect is actually you can. Messages are real important for you. You can stamp them, and thereby people will over time be used to checking, is this actually an approved statement from an important person?
How long will it be before we can do that?
You could do it today.
You could do it today, but nobody is doing it.
Well, yeah, they're prominent. As I suggested, you don't do it so much in the news space, but you do it in various industrial cases where you want to prove the provenance of a product, and that might as well be a piece of news. We could do it for the White House tomorrow if they wanted to do it.
I think you could do this, for official statements. I mean, that would be like watermarking them. What it's unlikely to deal with is what purports to be something that was surreptitiously taped. Yes. But I think eventually one of the things a tool like this would allow us to do is educate people over time to look for certain things, like you look at the sell-by date when you buy milk or something. So there is a way in which, again, it's not a magic bullet, but it can be a useful tool.
Yeah. But doesn't that potentially undermine faith in all video? And any politician could use it as an excuse. Something surfaces that may be real, but it's unflattering to them, and they just say, it's manipulated, it's fake.
We're already there. We already have this. Seriously. So, I mean, there's no way you can stop people from arguing that you shouldn't believe your lying eyes, you should believe what I tell you. But I think most people, not everybody, eventually, if you're giving them the tools to mark what is likely to be real and what's likely not to be real, at least it gives them an ability to exercise judgment.
Yeah, and politicians saying that they're not being faithfully represented is as old as the hills. In the 20 years I was in politics, the most common refrain was, the journalist has misquoted me or taken something out of context.
But there wasn't always some recording.
No.
That's the difference.
I don't mean it quite as sort of glibly as it comes across, but I do think we should remember that people are used to the idea that there are competing claims about what has been and has not been said, whether context has been adequately portrayed or not. That is not, we have, in mature democracies, we've got quite a sophisticated culture which can handle some of those complex concepts.
I mean,
Sasha?
it does seem clear in the lead up to elections, for instance, there does need to be a sort of coordinated effort of companies and of governments to be watchful and to be responsive to specific incidents very, very, very quickly. Obviously, this is, an important moment in time, and it needs to be treated in a different way, and political process needs to be treated in a different way to the other types of environments and contexts in which fake might be used. What's interesting, actually, in the analysis that we've done of information operations targeting elections over the last 3 years, let's say, across Europe, we've seen a trend actually away from obvious fakery in terms of content, obvious fakery in terms of distribution, bots and so on and so forth. And actually, I call it a sort of transition from information warfare to narrative warfare, sort of intensive narrative competition, where credible sourced information, true information, is used out of context and sort of manipulated, if you like, to create a narrative dynamic in the interests of malign actors. That's something I think, we really, really challenged in terms of how we confront and what we do about.
What is Facebook doing about that?
No, I agree. I mean, it's reflected, for instance, in the because Facebook obviously had to learn some very tough lessons very quickly after the 2016 US presidential election, and so now the approach that companies taken is just a sort of galaxy apart from back then in terms of resources, people, content moderators, machine learning tools to try and...
But still imperfect.
Of course. This is a platform where just messaging, never mind posts on social media, there are 100 billion messages a day. We're blocking 1 million fake accounts every day. The scale of this is enormous. And of course, in a free society where people can use, which is the joyous, positive side of social media, which we mustn't entirely forget, which is it gives people the right to say what they like to their friends, to their family, and so on and so forth, when they like, without being told what to do. But back to the point, which I strongly agree with, one of the new provisions we put in place, which you may be aware of, is that if you pay for a political ad now, that you have to say who you are, it has to be a disclaimer, and that political ad will now go into an archive for 7 years. Everyone can look, it's not working perfectly again, but we've set it up recently. Everyone will then be able to, researchers, journalists, opponents, will be able to look at who paid for the ad, who saw it, what was the purpose of it. But crucially, to your point, we've expanded that to what they call in sort of Silicon Valley jargon, issue ads, because what we have long understood, exactly this point, it isn't actually through conventional party political advertising that the interference is deployed. It's through highly divisive issues, immigration, ethnicity, religion, anything that divides. It's a sort of form of information vandalism. And that's where the ads are often deployed to the greatest destructive effect. And that's why we now include issue ads in that archive as well. So we go way beyond vote for this candidate for this political party. But if there are also ads which we categorize as issue ads on those sensitive topics, that they are also stored for maximum transparency and scrutiny.
Enough transparency, Sasha?
Well, this is a hugely welcome step in the right direction. Of course, it applies now to the EU. It doesn't apply globally. We'd love to see that apply globally. Just in the context of the EU, we did monitor the extent to which those commitments made by the companies for ad transparency were really maintained. There were teething problems, and I think that that's quite clear. So, for instance, there were adverts that, were substantially, sort of from a content standpoint, problematic. So they contained all sorts of sort of nasty hate speech, defamation, and so on and so forth. There's a content issue. Plenty of political ads that should have been in the database were not captured in the database. And there were many false positives. All of that, I'm sure, can be worked out over time. One of the problems with it is that when you forward on an ad, the sponsored by information actually gets removed. And as we know, when things are shared within peer groups, they tend to be believed a little bit more than if they're from external sources. So those tweaks need to happen for the system to work properly. And there were some real problems in the context of the European parliamentary elections. But we welcome this move, and the direction is right. There needs to be some transparency around how issues are selected country by country. There does need to be collaboration with expert communities that can speak to what issues need to be captured within that ad library.
But I think Sasha raises another point that is important to think about. We tend to talk about this in terms of the content. And actually, in many cases, the content's not obviously totally false. It's taken out of context. It may even be true, but simply exaggerated. The real novelty with social media is the way in which things become viral. And there are really three dimensions to that. One is impersonation of people. So you appear to be trustworthy when you're really not. Second is using automated means or concerted efforts to amplify a message by raising it up in the search. And then the third, and maybe the toughest for the platforms, is what I call reinforcement, which is what I said earlier, is this tendency to suggest further places you might go based on interests that tend to take you more in the extreme. And those are things we could deal with.
And we're going to talk about that in a minute, but first I want to take us back to the Dahlia polling and look at a question they asked. They had said, do you think that social media platforms have a positive or negative impact on democracy in your country? Can we look at that graphic? Can we get that up? The Dahlia slide? Well, let me tell you briefly. That the majority of people around the world believe that social media platforms have an overall positive effect on democracy, but several countries disagree, prominent amongst those Austria, Canada, and the United States. I'm just curious here on this stage, Nick, I'm going to leave you out of this question because I know what you think. For the rest of you, what do you think? Positive or negative impact on democracy overall?
Clearly positive, because it introduces a dialogue and a debate that couldn't otherwise be had, and actually takes people that can't get through the media in normal ways, gives them a voice and gives them an opportunity to cooperate around issues. So I would say unquestionably the overall balance is a positive to democracy. I can't see how you could possibly argue anything else. Then you have some threats, of course, of people abusing this system, and with the fear of repeating myself, I think we are slightly coming from the wrong angle here. 5 years from now, everybody that has a serious message, a serious product, a serious wish to secure and prove the provenance of that product will do so. You have the technology already. It's an obvious solution that any newspaper or any TV station will want to just prove that this came from them, which means that you can start at Facebook by saying, all of this we know is true. You can do that automatically. You don't have to look at it. We know that that statement came from the White House. We know that CNN produced this media bit. You don't have to look at it. And then you can start looking at all the stuff that doesn't have that provenance. So I think that's where the solution is going to come. It will be cheap. It will be near free to do that. So why wouldn't people secure that? And I think that will also help reinstate some belief, at least. I know you're already doing it, because if you're sharing a link, you'll say, okay, here's a little message about this media, and it's so and so. But you could still cheat with that. You could, in a way, still pretend to be that media. In my former life, I founded a bank and I ran it, and we occasionally found out all of a sudden that somebody had entirely copied our front page on the website in some weird destination, and then actually some people would have sent money into them, and we would have to go and speak to people to take this website down. This you could protect against today very easily, and I think that's a very, very big part of the solution, at least.
Sasha, positive or negative?
So this has been an information revolution. It's absolutely seismic, and it's altered the factors of power around the world in an extraordinary way, and in an altogether positive way. And it's extended, in a way, the playing field for free speech around the world in an extraordinary way. But if the playing field isn't maintained as level, then we have a problem. And what I would say is that the technological architecture of these platforms, of course, is not neutral and is increasingly tilted, as Michael has said, in a way in the favor of more and more extreme sensationalist messaging. And that leads systemically to polarization and the rise of what I would call sort of mainstreamed extremism. There are solutions to that. And we need to be working across sectors to deliver those.
Well, some people ask if part of the solution is regulation. That was another question that Dahlia asked. Do you want more social media regulation? And we see the answers there. There is support for it in some countries, significant support in Peru, interestingly, China and Spain. Michael Chertoff, is regulation of social media the answer?
Well, one of the issues in the U.S., we have a First Amendment, and I think social media platforms have a First Amendment right. It's kind of an editorial right. I think, therefore, there's some specific areas where you can regulate. Child pornography, for example, is illegal. Incitement to violence is illegal. What I would like to see, rather than outright regulation, is bringing together a multi-stakeholder model with the platforms, with civil society, with the government, but not as a mandate, as a how do we work together to achieve a result in which we can assure people of the accuracy and the provenance of what they're saying.
Now, Mark Zuckerberg has said he would welcome some regulation. Can you be more specific about what Facebook would like to see?
Yeah, four principal areas Mark Zuckerberg and the company are sort of working on at the moment, and one of the reasons I'm dashing around Europe at the moment is to try and see whether we can work with governments to assist as they develop their thinking on regulation. One, privacy. We've got the GDPR here in Europe, but privacy provisions are pretty patchy elsewhere, and I'm sure GDPR will need to be supplemented. Secondly, elections, the subject of the Commission. I found myself in the bizarre, almost ludicrous position back in January, having relatively recently started at Facebook, as a Brit, still just in the European Union, working for an American company, making a presentation in Brussels, a stone's throw away from the office I had as an MEP when I was elected for the European Parliament 20 years ago, setting out Facebook's ideas on how we were going to insist on authorization, declarations, disclaimers, political archives for a European election. And I sort of stopped midway through and I said, I really hope the next European elections, I'm not presenting to you what we're doing, you're telling us what we should be doing to conform to your rules. And that could only be done by politicians and legislators. I'd say there's one other area which I personally think, firstly, Michael's completely right. There's a gulf in sort of cultural, constitutional assumptions on the most difficult issue of all, which is not the legal distinction on speech, because that's just a matter of law, but it's legal but really unpleasant, divisive, harmful content. Because that's always in the eye of the beholder. Dare I say it, here in Scandinavia, people have a slightly more unbuttoned approach to nudity here than they do in Saudi Arabia, Texas or Britain. Not that there's any similarity between those three in any other respect, before I cause another incident. So that's the hardest bit, and I think in the United States there'll be no question. You won't want to, and you shouldn't, for the constitutional reasons that Michael set out, regulate that. So you do need more, maybe something analogous, but much more elaborate than what operates in the motion picture sort of industry, where you have. But can I just say one specific thing? It's just I think, a really good example of where regulation is, in my view, long overdue. And let me take it from the point of view of Facebook. After Cambridge Analytica, quite rightly, Facebook has been put under huge pressure to lock down data, to not allow data to go sort of walkabout from its platform. And this has been a big change. Many years ago, Facebook used to be accused of being a walled garden, hoarding the data. Then Mark Zuckerberg opened up the platform for lots of developers, which spawned huge amounts of innovation. Remember, it was an academic from Cambridge University who took this data legitimately and illegitimately sold it on. So now the pendulum's swinging back. The wall is being rebuilt. I guarantee you in a few years' time or a few months' time, Facebook will be accused again of hoarding and walling in too much data. If we want proper innovation and competition in the online space, we have to work out a way in which, yes, we guarantee privacy, but we have rules on data portability so people can take their data, their sort of data identity from one social media platform and go to a rival and competing one. Those rules don't exist. Private companies shouldn't come up with those rules. That's what lawmakers should do.
Lars, can citizens gain some control over their data, again, through technologies like blockchain?
Absolutely, because one of the other key use cases is actually portable identity and self-sovereign identity, so surely also a blockchain use case. But I would like to just get back to what you said, because yes, there are some extremist use and some foreign powers that use some of these social media without question. But we also have to be very careful that we don't create a legislation that means that whatever is the consensus view of the center is the only thing that's allowed. For example, on Facebook, you have a lot of people monitoring manually for hate speech, right? Now, I know people in Denmark, in this country, that regularly get shut down on Facebook because they make a statement about some obvious problem related to immigration. And for sure, these guys are not racist, they're not Nazis, they're not hate speeches. They're simply pointing out some kind of factual problem, like higher crime rate in this group than in that group. Regularly, these people get their freedom of speech reduced by Facebook simply shutting them off for a week, for a month. And on nudity, you're right. I had an example myself. Very sadly, a good friend of mine died in a tragic incident. He was a world-famous photographer, Belgian photographer. Some of his photographs had slight erotic aspects, and I didn't think about it. So I put up like a homage to this guy that's just died, and I was shut off Facebook for 2 weeks because I oversaw a nipple somewhere, you know. And of course, this kind of control, we also have to be sure that it's not just the powers that are there now, that you rule out any kind of questioning of the general consensus of Western democracy.
Which is why, like I think Michael has rightly said, the focus to date of regulators and policymakers has been largely on content removal, content moderation, asking companies to do basically their own moderation of nasty stuff. Now, illegal content should be removed and it should be done fast. But as you've said, in the context of any kind of content where a free speech argument can legitimately be applied, that grey area, which is most of what we see, misinformation, hate speech, and so on, something else needs to happen. And I think there's two ways in which, you know, the argument for a long time was, well, bad speech, more speech, let's compete with it. And indeed, we worked with a number of the companies, with Facebook, with Google, with Microsoft, to try and empower civil society to outcompete the bad stuff with good stuff. Except that it doesn't quite work if the playing field isn't level, and it's not level on two accounts. It's not level because of bad behaviors, and that's a sort of cyber hygiene issue, bots and amplification and manipulation. But it's also not level because of the ways in which your data is harvested and utilized. The algorithms in the ad tech marketing system are designed. And again, as I said, it sort of distorts the level playing field of free speech. What we really need to be looking at in terms of regulation is an oversight, if you like, of algorithmic outcome. We need to know, we need to test how certain, how are you seeing the world as a result of the data that's being harvested on you? The transparency around that is absolutely vital. If we see that systematically you are ending up seeing the world in a certain way that polarizes you from the rest, then we have a problem on our hands, and that is the piece that really needs regulation.
And Nick, will you do that? Will you make this more transparent?
So already now, actually just started 2 months ago, if you see something on your Facebook news feed and you sort of think, why is it being ranked in that way? Because I'll come in a minute, because I think there's a bit, we sometimes talk slightly cross-purpose about what an algorithm does on social media as opposed to search engines and recommendation engines, which is slightly different. But you can now click on a why am I seeing this, and we try and explain why. I'm going to blight Sasha's reputation for independence by agreeing with her all the time, but I actually agree with the way you phrased it, which is the outcomes. Okay. And that's a very important distinction, because too often I hear people say, we must have a look at your algorithm, as if it's a sort of lizard in a black box in Silicon Valley. And if you open it, people go, that's why I'm seeing. It doesn't, looking at an algorithm doesn't tell you anything. No. The thing, because let's remember what is the pragmatic issue that in the case of Facebook, which as I say is quite different to the way algorithms are used on other platforms and other companies, which I'll let speak for themselves. But for us, what is the problem? Most people, I don't know what you find, for those of you who use Facebook, look at Facebook when you're standing in the queue in the supermarket, or you're waiting for the bus, or you're waiting for your kid to come out of school, and you scroll on your newsfeed. So the dilemma the algorithm principally is trying to work out is, given you're not going to go right, you're not going to scroll infinitely, what do you see first? And what you see for those first few minutes is disproportionately important. Now, the main signal that determines what you see first is set by you. It's your friends, the proximity of the people you communicate with, the groups you're part of, the posts you go on. And then the algorithm takes a bunch of other signals, both on Facebook's products and what you do on the internet generally. There's a totally legitimate debate, which I think policymakers are now having, about whether those signals, the net is cast too wide, whether the data is held too long, whether, all of that, totally legitimate. But the basic idea that when you've got so much sort of content, some people, by the way, you can switch the settings, so you just see it chronologically. But what the algorithm does is to try not to sort of draw you down a funnel, because the funnel is determined by particularly your own friends and the proximity of the people you're with, but to try and prioritize those things which which appear to interest you the most. And crucially, and this is the bit that we're working on actively now in Facebook, is that, of course, we have found, we've done a lot of research with a lot of academics and so on, that, of course, it's human nature. If you see something which is clickbaity and angry and sensationalist, and something which provokes primitive emotions of fear or anger, by the way, just like tabloid newspaper headlines. Sure. I mean, this is not new. I sometimes pick up a British tabloid newspaper and think, oh, God, I'm so annoyed I've done that. But you do it because the headline's so arresting. Exactly the same thing happens on the online world. And guess what we've discovered? Is that even though, yes, it is true that attracts attention and engagement, in the long run, it actually discourages people from continuing to use our services. So this is not an altruistic point. From Facebook's point of view, we have absolutely no interest in clickbaity, sensationalist, polarizing material becoming too predominant, because people will stop using the product.
Do they stop using it, or does it draw them in? No,
the evidence is overwhelming that people will, and actually, I mean, joking aside about British tabloids, which are, of course, magnificent in so many other respects, it's actually quite a good parallel that you'll find yourself being drawn to a headline. You kind of know it's probably not right, and it's appealing to certain primitive emotions, and you're kind of not really sure whether you want to repeat the exercise, but you keep finding yourself doing it. The evidence is clear. Our users will end up enjoying the experience of using the product less. And on the whole, so I think this is the point made earlier, let's not forget, the vast majority of people go to social media not to look at news. News content in terms of the total content of newsfeed is just over 4%. So they don't go for politics and news. They go to exchange photos of their cats, their kids, posting photographs of their holidays, being part of groups to campaign for something on your local community. Most of it is playful, joyful, and bereft of polarization and politics. And the platform, I know the allegation so often is the platform has an incentive to pollute the content with this stuff. It really, really doesn't. I mean, why should it? Because it's discouraging to continued sustainable use.
I want to remind all of you that we want your questions. So go to that app and type in your questions for this great panel. First of all, any reaction to what Nick just said? Do you buy that people aren't clicking on this sensational content?
I haven't seen that data, but that's very interesting if it's off-putting long term. I mean, I think in terms of democracy, what we're seeing is people are being put off, actually, by an altogether confusing information environment. And that is extremely important. I mean, much of what we've seen in terms of malign information operations is really targeted at dissuading people from the authenticity and legitimacy of the political process, of political debate. It's sort of encouraging apathy.
I would love to see that data also, because it doesn't really correspond with what you see in the general media picture, certainly not in this country, where clearly most of the media are using clickbait to drive traffic. Maybe they're wrong, but that would be interesting if you could convince them about it. Yeah. But it would be, is that something you published, or?
It's been done by independent experts. Mark Zuckerberg posted a blog, I think it was in November last year, where drawing from this research, he's now set in motion a whole bunch of work with engineers in Facebook to try and, in effect, reduce the prominence of what it's called in the jargon borderline content. Yep. So you've got the parameters of what's allowed and not allowed on these Facebook platforms. And what we discover is that the more borderline the content is, the more attractive it is, but for all the reasons I've explained. And so we're trying to do that. It's complicated. It's quite, how do you define borderline? But can I just, the reason it doesn't quite apply is, I think sometimes people forget, the point about Facebook is that each news feed is unique. That's the unusual thing about it. There's no, the news feed is the interaction between what you like and the friends and so on and so forth and the algorithm. And every single one is unique. That's the remarkable thing about this technology. So it's a very intimate, or at least supposed to be, it's an intimate experience. It's not like picking up a newspaper or going to broadcast news. It's a almost reflection of who you are on your newsfeed.
Yeah, but the question is to what extent the algorithm,
Right.
and I'm using the sense, make a judgment in a figurative sense, makes a judgment about what you like and whether that drives you in the direction of things that tend to reinforce a particular message. Because if the idea is to keep people on the site as long as possible, what you're trying to do is attract that element of curiosity which is embedded in what they're looking at. Now, some of it may be your friends, and that's where the impersonation issue comes from. Some of it may be popularity. A lot of people are looking at this or talking about it, which is the issue of amplification. But then the third issue is there embedded within the algorithm an assessment of the germ of your interest that takes you in a certain direction?
I mean,
if I could, we have a question in from the audience here. How big is this problem really, the problem of social media? You talk as if it's a given fact that this is a big problem, but speaking of facts, what are the facts of the problem?
I think virality is a big issue. I think, and you know, I think it's implicit in the question. I personally do think sometimes I hear claims made about, you know, that nastiness, polarization, extremism was invented 15 years ago in Facebook. I mean, it's just clearly not the case. I'm afraid there's something, you know, if you hold up a mirror to human nature, guess what? You find everything that's beautiful and horrific about human nature. Technology is not good.
You don't acknowledge that it's amplified it?
No, I do. That's my whole point.
Okay.
I think virality is new. It's speed, scale, voice and virality, that is new, and that does bring with it downsides. But I do think for folk who, and everybody here is here because we're interested in this, we do need to be careful that as we try and put in place guardrails for the internet and the online world, we mustn't talk ourselves into this view that sort of there's something inherently bad in technology. Is not inherently good or bad. It's used by good or bad people for good or bad ends. It always was the case. A car is a wonderful technology. You put a bad person behind the steering wheel of a car, they can do immense damage to other people. It's always been the case that people can use technology for virtuous and vile purposes.
But I wouldn't compare a social media platform to a car, which it would damage a limited number of people, and social media's sweep is.
Have you seen how many people are maimed and killed by cars?
Oh,
I mean,
well,
the printing
but
press.
it can't
The printing
compare
press
to
has
the-
produced
how many-
Shakespeare and Mein Kampf. I mean, all technology, if it allows people to say stuff and communicate with each other, you will bring out the good and the bad.
well, cars are interesting. I mean, there have been, you know, over time, we've built out ethical guidelines and practices in engineering in all sorts of domains, in all sorts of sectors, in order to make sure that public health is respected and maintained. Now, that has to happen now in the context of this form of technology, and hasn't happened enough. Now, how big is this problem? It's both a problem and a huge opportunity, but it's how many users do you have?
2.7 billion.
That's how big, because that's enormous centralized power without democratic oversight. And so we're still at the very outset of the internet era. This is a little bit the Wild West. I'm convinced that over the next 5 to 10 years, we will see the rules in place to do something about that challenge. But I think we do focus a lot on the big internet companies. It is important to understand the wider information ecosystem, the alt tech spaces where a lot of the really nasty stuff has ended up sort of migrating and being pushed out to, as we've seen some of this limited on the big platforms. And also mainstream media. There is a sort of information ecosystem that drives some of these challenges that we're talking about in terms of democracy and other harms. So we need to be looking at the slightly bigger picture. And then law. We are challenged in the internet, in the technological era, in the 21st century, in relation to how existing laws apply online or get enforced online. So many of the problems that we see in terms of misinformation are to do with, a sort of libelous or harassment, or to do with illegal hate speech and so on. Laws apply here, except they don't get enforced very easily online. And this is a question for governments. How do we upskill our entire system, courts, law enforcement, to be able to actually apply law online?
Michael, as the lawyer.
Well, no, I mean, I think we do have to adapt the law, but not maybe the legal principles. I mean, I still think the First Amendment and the values that we believe in that underpin our constitutions are important. But one thing I think is also important, as Sasha kind of triggered in me, some of the problems that arise are not a function of the platform or the algorithm, but there's the people on it. You get some weird people out there, and when you have any kind of a mechanism that allows them to amplify their views, you're going to get some strange views out there. And so again, I want to always be careful we don't make a cure that's worse than the disease. And I still think, on balance, free speech, as long as you've stripped out virality, you have to look to more speech as the cure.
Lars, did you want to weigh in on that
Yeah, I
question?
just also think, going with that also, we have to realize that politics is about influencing people, right? I mean, the guy that speaks really well is more likely to do very well than the guy that can't put two words together, right? The guy that has the biggest budget, that can buy most advertising and most TV spots and most Facebook advertising, is more likely to win because he's better chance to get his message out. So here, actually, you are also opening for people that don't have that economic power to get their message through, actually can get it through in completely different ways. So I totally agree. We have to be, it's a very fine borderline between using freedom of speech to its extreme and then to try to impose some kind of consensus morality or political view upon people as a whole. And I think we just had an election in this country. We have a very different system to both UK and US, a lot of small parties. We had one party which was very controversial. A guy was very anti-immigration, went out to various ghettos and burned off Korans and stuff like that. And he actually was sent out with 50 policemen every time to protect his freedom of speech, right? On Facebook, he would get shut down. Can we have a discrepancy between what you can do on social media and what you can do in real society? There's a lot of problems here. I mean, that guy is a disgusting guy, in my view, but we actually protect him with 50 cops.
But there's a scale difference there, which is enormous.
Doesn't matter. It scales. If you raise $1 billion and you're running for president, that scales a lot more than if you don't have money, right?
I want to work in a couple more questions. Here's one. Calls for social media regulation and an increased role for government become more contentious when considering the potential role of non-democratic governments in overseeing online content. How does the panel think this problem should be approached? Nick?
Well, I think where we need to start is by promulgating better rules, norms, and regulations, as we've just discussed, in the democratic world. One of my biggest fears is, look, we don't have a global internet anymore. It doesn't exist. We have a Chinese internet. We have the Russians now emulating exactly, trying to just copy the playbook. But look at the debate in countries as diverse as India, Turkey, Vietnam. You've now got more and more demands on companies like Facebook from often non-democratic governments to store data in the territory in question, which raises the spectre that will then allow those authoritarian regimes to invade the privacy of their own citizens. So I just think, whilst quite rightly in the democratic world we're having ferocious debates about privacy and data use and the balance of the relationship between the individual citizen over their data and these big companies like Facebook, Google, and so on, the bigger picture is that first you're having this massive tech contest going on between China and America, where Europe plays this odd rule, doesn't have a dog in the fight, because we don't, alas, have big tech companies in Europe in the same way, but it does have an outsized role in setting the rules and the regulations. And I really hope as Europe, because I think you're right, in the next few years we will see new rules and norms and laws. I hope Europe in particular, the European Union, much as it has done on GDPR, not only creates these rules for itself, but does so in a way which can be emulated across the democratic world. So we have a level playing field in a way which can at least act as a bulwark against the obvious trend towards authoritarian, non-democratic regimes wanting to muscle in on the data of their own citizens.
I think that's a really important point. And I'd add to it the concern that I've now heard expressed from people in a whole number of countries in what we generally call like-minded nations, that if the data of these countries is in China, it's going to be fed into an artificial intelligence machine and become part of an apparatus for directly influencing elections and behavior and things like that. So I do think it's really important for the more or less liberal democratic nations to come together and reach some kind of essentially a workable reciprocity, because otherwise I think we are going to wind up with a splinter net. And as it is, I think we're going to have a somewhat bifurcated internet.
Yeah.
We're almost out of time, and I want to wrap this up by asking you all a question. When we have a global democracy summit in another 5 years, what are we going to be saying about this intersection of technology and democracy? Are there going to be new issues? Are there going to be new solutions? What is emerging here? Sasha, why don't you take that first?
Goodness. I very much hope that we will be in a position in 5 years to have dealt with some of the critical problems that we're dealing with now in terms of the sort of distortive elements of these platforms. I think it's absolutely right. We are, in a way, this is an existential moment. We see around the world the rise of authoritarian nationalism, transnational extremism of a nationalist variant, and this being both boosted by certain state actors, but also by the sort of technological architecture that we've just talked about. We have to come together, and it is in the interest of these Western companies to be working very closely with government. Now, to set the standards and norms of how we're going to operate in a digital era. And there is a huge amount that we need to be doing in terms of digital citizenship, education, not just of young people, but of everybody. We need to universalize that and of our systems. So I think we'll be, I hope, in a stronger position. The flip side, if we don't manage that, is that we will see essentially liberal democracy on the back foot. The thing that they have right now is countercultural momentum. And we need to make sure that that doesn't win out, because we will be living in a very, very damaged, dangerous environment.
10 seconds. Anybody else want to make input?
I think there's a real possibility that some of the things we're talking about here will be introduced as correctives to virality. What I'm concerned about is I think information conflict will continue, and what we may see is more hacking and doxing, releasing of true but sensitive material, which can have very destructive effect, and actually direct interference with the mechanism of elections or election day with cyber attacks. And that's, I think, a serious issue in terms of the mechanics of the electoral process.
Lars, quickly.
Yeah, I would say I hope that 5 years from now you would use technology that actually already exists to know with certainty that a message comes from the person or from the institution or from the company or whoever that it portrays to come from, one. And secondly, I hope once we know who we're dealing with, and of course it's a problem if it's somebody else that's saying something in another's name, but once we know who we're dealing with, I hope that we are very careful not to introduce too many rules that actually could infringe on freedom of speech just because there are certain things we don't like to hear. There are things you don't like to hear, there are things I don't like to hear. But we really have to think about whether we stop them from saying them, right?
Nick, last word, very quickly.
No, I'm optimistic. I think if you look, certainly from the vantage point of where I work now, if you look at the complete transformation, the way in which the industry is trying to deal with the lessons that it learned the hard way after the 2016 presidential election, and the greater cooperation that is now taking place between governments, industry, amongst the industry themselves, the threat will mutate. It will never go away. It's a cat and mouse game, but I hope in 5 years, most importantly, the public at large in the democratic world will feel that there are guardrails in place which are trying to strike that right balance between freedom and responsibility.
We have to leave it there. Nick, Michael, Lars, Sasha, thank you all so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for your questions in the audience. We are going to take a break now. Let me tell you, for those of you who have work you need to do, emails, phone calls, etc., there are some work lounges outside. They're in the balcony around the foyer, and we will reconvene at 11:05. See you there.
Thank you.
Thank you.